Imagine this. You wake up one morning, every muscle in your body aching, as if you've been dragged through a stormy night of restless sleep. Yet, the sun filters softly through the curtains, promising a gentle day ahead. You lie there staring at the ceiling, and suddenly a question presses itself against the walls of your mind, deafening in its silence. Was this life I've committed to, the freedom I sought, or a cage I willingly built? Marriage, the word itself is a prism, refracting love, security, hope. We are told it is the crowning achievement of adult life, the sanctuary where two halves become a whole. But what if hidden inside that sanctuary is a psychological trap so subtle, so shrouded in tradition and expectation, that almost no one dares to admit its presence? You carry the paradox like a secret weight. On one hand, marriage promises unity, a shared future where loneliness is outlawed, and partnership becomes the antidote to isolation. On the other, it can metamorphose into an unacknowledged imprisonment. The very institution designed to liberate the human spirit from solitude can tether it instead, sometimes inescapably so. How can the same act that binds two people in love also chain them to patterns of stagnation, dependency, and silent suffering? This tension does not announce itself with fanfare. It creeps in, a slow erosion of identity beneath the veneer of shared life. The paradox is this: marriage, the social ideal of intimate connection, often requires a surrender, not just to another's presence but to the invisible scripts written by society, history, and even our own subconscious fears. Surrender comes disguised as love, duty, and commitment. You may not realize that in saying, "I do," you may be agreeing to more than just partnership. You might be stepping into a psychological labyrinth that few admit exists. Ask yourself, how often have you heard someone say, "I feel trapped in my marriage," only to respond with a nervous laugh or a quick deflection? Or perhaps you felt it yourself, a creeping sense of suffocation beneath the routine, a quiet desperation masked in smiles and obligations. Why is this so rarely spoken aloud? Is it because admitting these feelings would unravel the carefully maintained illusion of marriage as an unblemished ideal? Or is it because the trap itself is woven into the very fabric of our expectations, so that recognizing it would mean questioning the foundation of human relationships and possibly your own choices? Consider the stories we inherit from our families and cultures. Marriage as a contract of permanence, a fortress against chaos, an anchor in the turbulent sea of existence. But permanence, by its very nature, demands sacrifice, rigidity, and sometimes the erasure of individual evolution. What happens when the person you marry evolves beyond the self you once loved? When the romantic myth clashes with the relentless reality of time and change? The psychic tension born here is profound. It is not just about disappointment. It is about the existential anxiety of being caught between the desire for connection and the need for freedom. How do you measure love when it becomes entangled with obligation? When the promise to stay together through thick and thin transforms into a psychological contract that suppresses dissent, masks dissatisfaction, and normalizes compromise to the point of invisibility? Is love still love when it asks you to shrink yourself? Or is there a hidden coercion, a silent demand lurking beneath the veneer of mutual care? This silent demand, the psychological trap no one admits, often masquerades as loyalty, responsibility, or sacrifice. Yet its grip tightens slowly, imperceptibly, like a vine wrapping around a tree, nourishing and constricting simultaneously. Your life, your desires, your dreams begin to adapt, not necessarily because you choose to, but because the fear of breaking the bond, the terror of loneliness, or the dread of social judgment pulls you inward. Imagine the subtle shifts, conversations you avoid because they might lead to conflict, emotions you bury to keep the peace, a perennial compromise that increasingly feels like erasure. The paradox deepens. What started as an act of unity gradually becomes a source of division within yourself. Who are you beneath the roles of spouse, partner, caregiver, and cohabitant? Are you still the person who once dreamed freely, or someone reshaped by the invisible architecture of marital expectation? And yet, this is not a call to cynicism. Neither is it a manifesto against love or commitment. Rather, it demands a courageous reckoning with the unspoken dimensions of marriage. Because to live authentically within it, to navigate its promises and pitfalls, you must confront this tension head-on. You must ask, what are we really entrusting ourselves to when we say forever? What unseen pacts do we make, not just with another person, but with ourselves, society, and the very narrative of love? This question is not a mere philosophical curiosity. It is an urgent existential challenge. For if marriage can become a psychological cage, then understanding its locks and keys becomes essential to human freedom. How do we honor love's transformative power without losing ourselves? How do we embrace connection without surrendering autonomy? Before the answers begin to emerge, the trap must first be named, and its contours studied. It is this delicate, shadowy terrain where our story must now tread. Because to escape this psychological snare, or to live within it without losing the self, we must first understand how it was set in place, how silence, expectation, and fear weave together to ensnare even the most hopeful hearts. Brace yourself, then, for a journey into the heart of marriage's hidden paradox. It is a terrain where love and confinement coexist, where the promise of union can harbor the threat of dissolution, not by breaking apart from each other, but by fracturing the self inside. And in that fracturing lies the psychological trap no one admits, but all who marry must somehow face. What follows is not an indictment, but an unveiling, a peeling back of layers that most dare not glimpse, but that every soul entangled in marriage must come to recognize. Because only when you see the trap can you begin to hold its keys, and perhaps find a way to walk through fire without becoming ash. Imagine the moment you first embraced the idea of marriage, not as a celebration, but as a surrender. How often do we overlook the invisible web spun through centuries of human thought, the weighty shadows cast by philosophy and psychology upon this institution? This trap isn't accidental. It is constructed, layer by layer, by the very frameworks through which humanity has understood itself and its yearning for connection. The question is not only why marriage can ensnare the self, but why, despite its risks, it remains an almost universal ritual, a crucible where hope and despair mingle. Carl Jung offers a starting point for unraveling this mystery. He spoke of the persona, the mask we wear to conform to external expectations, and the shadow, the hidden parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. Marriage demands a persona be worn, a version of the self that fits a socially acceptable mold, reliable, committed, nurturing. To be a good spouse is to enact a role scripted by culture, tradition, and often silent agreements. But beneath that surface, the shadow lurks, the desires, fears, and contradictions that marriage cannot absorb without distortion. When the self is divided between persona and shadow, the marriage becomes a battleground for authenticity and repression. Nietzsche's philosophy deepens the paradox. He warned against the slave morality that subdues the individual's creative power and instinctual drive under the weight of imposed values. Marriage, in many societies, functions as one such mechanism, demanding conformity to roles that often suppress the will to power, the desire to define and pursue one's unique path. What Nietzsche named the death of the self is echoed in the silent sacrifices married individuals make, the relinquishing of unspoken dreams, the quiet resignation of personal ambitions. Yet, is this death necessary for love? Or is it a betrayal, a slow erasure hidden beneath vows and anniversaries? Arthur Schopenhauer's bleak insight into human desire and suffering also reverberates here. He viewed existence itself as marked by a relentless striving, an insatiable will that marriage attempts to tame but can hardly satisfy. Love, from his perspective, is a cunning illusion, a strategy of nature to perpetuate the species rather than to fulfill human happiness. Marriage, then, is the theatrical stage where this illusory promise plays out. But behind the curtains lies an abyss of frustration, boredom, and unfulfilled longing. Could it be that the psychological trap is rooted in this fundamental mismatch between what marriage promises and what human nature can endure? Aldous Huxley's dystopian imaginings cast light on the societal machinery behind this hidden force. Marriage is not just a personal commitment, but a social contract reinforced by culture, law, religion, and economic structures. It stabilizes societies, but also confines individuals within predefined roles, limiting the fluidity and multiplicity of human identity. In the steady rhythm of everyday life, the subtle pressure to conform, be a good husband, be a good wife, quietly erodes spontaneity, creativity, and the freedom to evolve beyond prescribed identities. Is not the quiet despair many feel a result of this systematic enclosure? Jean-Paul Sartre, with his philosophy of existential freedom and responsibility, confronts us with the stark reality that marriage is both a choice and a limitation on freedom. In his view, human beings are condemned to be free, burdened with the responsibility to define themselves in every moment. Yet, when entering into a marriage, individuals often surrender this radical freedom, binding their identity to another's expectations and to a shared narrative. This tension between freedom and commitment generates a profound existential conflict. How to remain authentic and free in a union that demands compromise and sometimes sacrifice? Is this conflict the silent fracture within marriage that no one dares articulate? Viktor Frankl, who survived the abyss of the Holocaust, emphasized meaning as the core of human existence. From his lens, marriage should be a source of profound meaning, a partnership that enables transcending suffering and isolation. Yet, when the psychological trap manifests, meaning is not found but lost, buried beneath unmet needs, silent resentments, and the erosion of selfhood. Frankl's insight nudges us toward a piercing question. Can meaning be reclaimed within marriage, or is the very structure complicit in extinguishing the flame it promises to kindle? These philosophical and psychological forces intertwine with the cultural narrative that shrouds marriage. The myth of completion through union, the belief that another person can fill the void we feel inside. But what if this void is not meant to be filled by another, but rather confronted within ourselves? The paradox is agonizing. Marriage holds the promise of wholeness while often precipitating fragmentation. This hidden force manipulates behavior and emotions, fostering dependency, codependence, and a silent fear of dissolution, not only of the relationship, but of the self. This fear shapes identity profoundly. It presses you to silence doubts, to suppress desires that threaten the fragile equilibrium, to wear the mask of contentment even as the shadow grows restless. Beneath the surface, you may feel trapped not by chains of obligation alone, but by the dread of being utterly alone, with no narrative to soften the sting, no shared ritual to affirm your existence. The psychological trap of marriage is that it simultaneously promises belonging and enforces an existential exile within intimate proximity. What consequences lurk in this shadowed terrain? The erosion of spontaneity and authentic self-expression, the quiet cultivation of resentment, the slow calcification of dreams deferred or sacrificed. These are but symptoms. Deeper still lies a potential unraveling of identity when the self, fragmented and disguised, begins to dissolve. The paradox becomes clearer. The very institution designed to unite two lives can, paradoxically, precipitate an internal fissure that alienates you from your own essence. And as this fissure widens, it does not always shout in chaos or violence. More often, it whispers, in tired sighs, in fleeting moments of emptiness, in the subtle numbness that creeps over years. The trap's most insidious power is its invisibility. It is easier to accept quiet suffering, than to confront the terrifying possibility that the life you have chosen might be a cage disguised as a sanctuary. So what is marriage really? A sanctuary, a cage, or something even more complex? A place where freedom and confinement intertwine so tightly that disentangling one from the other seems impossible. The underlying forces uncovered by Jung, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Huxley, Sartre, and Frankl are not mere historical curiosities but living currents shaping human behavior and emotions today. They press upon you, molding identity even as you seek to shape the relationship itself. To move forward, to understand the trap fully, means to hold these tensions without flinching, to see marriage both as a human creation burdened by cultural and psychological forces, and as a personal crucible where freedom and selfhood are tested. The deeper consequences, beyond dissatisfaction or conflict, are what we must now confront. Because only when you recognize the depth of this psychological snare can you begin to question the narrative you have inherited, and ask whether freedom within marriage is possible, or if the trap is woven too tightly to ever be undone. This understanding is not an end but a threshold. Just beyond lies the terrain where pain transforms into insight, where surrender can become a choice rather than a defeat, and where the fragment itself might begin the slow, arduous process of reassembly. But first, you must look into the abyss that marriage sometimes exposes, and ask if what stares back is fear, illusion, or truth. You think you're steering your own ship, navigating the treacherous waters of love and commitment with clear eyes and a strong will. But what if the currents pulling you beneath the surface are invisible, whispering through your brain's wiring, your cultural upbringing, and the stories you've been told since childhood? Imagine that the trap into which marriage often slips has been laid long before the vows, woven so seamlessly into your perception that you don't even recognize the walls closing in. This is not a story of overt coercion or manipulation. It is the subtle architecture of your mind and society conspiring to make you see imprisonment as freedom, limitation as security, surrender as love. Look closely at your brain. It is an organ forged to create patterns, to find meaning, and to avoid pain. This is why confirmation bias is such a tyrant in your relationships, the quiet whisper that tells you what you want to hear, dismissing the dissonant, the threatening, the inconvenient truths. You remember the cheerful promises, the reassuring smiles, the brief shining moments that affirmed your choice. You ignore the nagging doubt, the growing walls of resentment, because your brain rewards consistency, not upheaval. The more you immerse yourself in a narrative, this is my partner, my life, my family, the more neural pathways strengthen around those beliefs. It becomes harder to imagine any other reality because your mind, wired for survival, punishes dissent. Neurologically, marriage can trigger a cocktail of hormones, oxytocin, vasopressin, dopamine, that flood your system with bonding chemicals, creating an illusion of security and intense emotional attachment. But this neurochemical euphoria is transient, a fog that hides the slow crystallization of unmet expectations and silent concessions. When the hormones recede, the starkness of daily reality creeps in, but your mind resists this shift, clinging to the remnants of that euphoric high. You begin to rationalize, to excuse, to shift blame inward rather than confront the too painful truth, that the structure you inhabiting may be a labyrinth with no exit. Yet this is not merely a neurological trap, it is a social one. From the moment you were young, the cultural myths that cocooned you shaped your idea of marriage. You were taught that marriage is the apex of success, the guaranteed path to happiness, the sacred institution that completes you. The narratives are everywhere, in films, in family traditions, in social rituals, that marriage is an unshakable unity, a fortress against loneliness and chaos. But what if these stories function less as liberators and more as chains? If society insists, implicitly and explicitly, that marriage is the only valid culmination of love, then your alternatives become invisible, unthinkable, or shameful. In this way, societal conditioning acts as a collective blindfold, obscuring paths of individual freedom and reshaping your desires to fit this predefined mold. Cognitive dissonance plays its role here too. You have invested time, emotion, and identity in your marriage. To admit its failure or its constraints is to admit to yourself that a significant part of your life was misdirected, perhaps even wasted. This is a psychological wound too deep to bear, so you suppress the questions, dismiss the suspicions, and bury the growing discomfort beneath ritual and routine. The trap tightens, silent but unyielding, like sand through your fingers. No matter how much you struggle, escape seems impossible because you no longer remember what the world looks like outside the cage. The chilling truth is that the psychological trap of marriage does not announce itself loudly. It whispers, seeps into the corners of your life, and becomes the baseline from which you judge all your choices. It shapes your self-concept, your ambitions, your very sense of happiness. It molds the way you interpret your partner's actions, coloring even moments of tenderness with doubt or resignation. And on a societal scale, this trap reproduces itself through generations, each inheritor swallowing the narrative whole, perpetuating a cycle of silent compromise and masked dissatisfaction. How many marriages quietly echo with unspoken desires, unmet needs, or dreams deferred? How many people walk through their lives with a gilded cage around their heart, believing it to be their sanctuary? This is the unspoken epidemic, a psychological condition masked as a social norm, whose symptoms are anxiety, isolation, and a creeping sense of self-loss. And all the while, the world outside the marriage bubble spins on, unaware that beneath the surface of its shining institutions, millions are caught in a snare they cannot name. You may ask yourself, if this trap is so pervasive, why do we rarely speak of it? Because to speak openly threatens not just personal identities but the collective myths that hold society together. To challenge the unchallenged is to risk ostracism, to invite doubt where certainty is valued above all else. And herein lies the cruel paradox. Your craving for safety and connection leads you into a structure that, paradoxically, may erode them both. The very thing meant to fulfill you becomes the silent author of your fracture. So what happens when you become conscious of this invisible captivity? When the fog begins to lift and you glimpse the bars of your own making? Does the weight of realization crush, or does it spark a fierce hunger for something different? This moment, fragile and terrifying, is where the possibility of liberation begins. But before you can even question the walls, you must understand their architecture, from the hardwiring of your brain to the social scripts etched into your psyche. The urgency here is existential, because the longer this trap remains unrecognized, the more it reshapes who you are, until you no longer remember what freedom felt like. And if freedom is lost this deeply, how can you reclaim it without first acknowledging the chains? The subtlety of this trap is its most dangerous weapon. It seduces with comfort and familiarity, convincing you that to escape would be to lose everything, even as it steals your very sense of self. In the quiet spaces between your daily routines, in the moments you dare not name aloud, this psychological prison pulses with silent power. It bends your reality, warps your desires, and quiets your voice. You stand at a crossroads, not yet aware that the path you are on is less a journey than a carefully constructed labyrinth designed to keep you lost. The breakthrough you seek is not simply about changing your circumstances, but about facing the invisible currents shaping your inner world. Forces you must wrestle with if you ever hope to break free from the psychological trap of marriage that no one admits exists. And as you stand there on the brink of understanding, the question remains, will you dare to confront the unseen forces that have held you captive for so long? Or will the silence continue, deep, invisible, and unyielding, until your own freedom becomes a forgotten dream? What if the very foundation of what you believed marriage to be its promises, its rituals, its unspoken codes, was not the cage, but the illusion of the cage. Imagine peeling back the layers, not just to scrutinize the visible walls, but to dismantle the architecture of the prison itself. What if the trap isn't marriage as an institution, but the narrative you have accepted about what marriage must be, what you must sacrifice, what you must become to sustain it? This is a radical shift, an upheaval of the ground beneath your feet, but one that carries the power to unshackle your mind before your circumstances even begin to loosen their grip. Marriage, as society sells it, is sanctified permanence, an unyielding contract that demands sacrifice and submission cloaked in love's language. Yet the paradox is that permanence, when weaponized, chokes the very essence of love and freedom. The psychological trap tightens when permanence becomes a prison sentence, when love is reduced to duty, and when your true self dissolves into the role you are expected to play. But what if you could redefine permanence, not as bondage, but as a deliberate choice refreshed every day, not as submission, but as mutual sovereignty? What if freedom isn't the opposite of commitment, but its radical core? To embrace this paradox is to rupture the old scripts that have been looping in your mind. You must question the unquestionable. Why do you persist in sacrificing your individuality? Why do you accept silence as the price of peace? Why is your identity so easily eclipsed by the title spouse? The radical truth is that this trap only holds power if you consent to its terms, a contract dictated by fear, habit, and unexamined beliefs. And here lies your awakening. Control is not in the hands of your partner, your circumstances, or society, but within your own mind. This awakening demands dismantling the internalized narratives that convince you freedom is lost forever the moment you say, "I do." What if those narratives are relics of a past culture? Look back not just centuries, but even decades, where countless individuals have shattered these chains not through rebellion, but through profound reimagination. Consider pioneering women who declared sovereignty over their lives well before society was ready, or artists and philosophers who rejected the notion that marriage equated to erasure of self. These were lives lived on the edge of convention, embodying the courage to redefine union on their own terms, inventing languages of relationship where partnership amplified autonomy rather than suppressed it. Take, for instance, Simone de Beauvoir, whose critique of marriage in The Second Sex is not a condemnation of love but a call to resist the marriage trap that stifles a woman's freedom. She did not advocate escape, but revolution, transforming the structures imprisoning identity and desire. And in more recent history, couples who practice conscious uncoupling, polyamory, or live in committed, yet non-traditional partnerships offer living blueprints for breaking the psychological chains while preserving connection. These examples are not just anecdotes, but revelations. The possibility that the architecture of marriage can be rebuilt from the ground up, with bricks forged from radical honesty, respect, and autonomy. To reclaim control over your marriage, you must first reclaim control over yourself. This begins with dismantling the pervasive myth that vulnerability is weakness, that boundaries are walls, that love demands self-sacrifice to the point of invisibility. In reality, vulnerability is the crucible of authenticity, boundaries are the scaffolding of respect, and true love is the soil in which your individuality flourishes. Imagine transforming your marriage from a cage into a greenhouse, where your unique self is nurtured, allowed to grow, to bloom, and to breathe freely within the shared space. But this transformation demands something more, the willingness to embrace discomfort and ambiguity. Breaking free does not mean instant liberation. It is a process fraught with uncertainty, fear, and the unsettling risk of dismantling long-held illusions. Yet within this uneasy space lies power. The power to redefine love and commitment not as chains, but as declarations of freedom chosen anew each day. The key lies in shifting the narrative from I must endure this for the sake of us. 2. We co-create spaces where both of us thrive as whole beings. One of the most radical mindset shifts is this. Instead of seeing your partner as the gatekeeper of your happiness or freedom, recognize yourself as the sovereign keeper of your own inner realm. Your emotional ecosystem does not depend on external validation or survival within a marriage that drains you. When you internalize this, you reclaim agency. Your daily decisions become acts of freedom, choosing what you accept, what you refuse, how you love, and how you define your boundaries. The trap dissolves in the recognition that the prison never held you, only your belief in its walls did. Imagine this power coursing through your veins, the ability to command your own psychological sovereignty, the power to rewrite the script from victim to co-author. This isn't about destroying what you have built, but transforming it into something that serves your authentic self and honors your partner's freedom as fiercely as your own. Your marriage becomes a dance of equals, no longer a battlefield or a cage. This is the revolution no one talks about, but every soul trapped within the psychological prison of marriage can initiate. You are not powerless. The chains you feel are forged by stories you were told, and stories can be rewritten. The question then shifts from how do I escape to how do I reconstruct the narrative I live by. When you grasp this, freedom is not a distant dream. It is a present reality waiting to be claimed in every moment. You are the architect of this new reality, and the revolution begins within. What if the very foundation of what you believed marriage to be, the sacred union, the emblem of love's triumph, was never truly about two souls intertwining? What if it was always, at its core, a crucible where the self is both forged and fractured, not by the presence of another, but by the internal battleground we refuse to name? Look back, not with regret but with fierce clarity, at every moment. You felt trapped, tethered, or diminished. Was it really the other who imprisoned you, or the unseen contract you signed with yourself, surrendering fragments of your essence in exchange for the promise of belonging, security, or identity? You have carried within you an ancient myth dressed in modern garb, the belief that love means losing yourself, that unity must come at the expense of individuality. You have learned to wear your compromises like a second skin, to silence your dissent because it seemed easier than the chaos of upheaval, easier than confronting the hollow echo of your own desires. But here lies the ultimate paradox, the trap you never admitted to yourself. Marriage is never the cage that holds you hostage. The cage is the story you tell yourself about marriage, the narrative that convinces you that your freedom, your joy, or your authenticity must be sacrificed at its altar. Peel away the layers one more time. Feel the weight of that invisible story pressing against your ribs, constricting your breath. This story says, you must belong to be loved. You must sacrifice to be accepted. You must lose to be found. But these are not laws of love. They are scripts written by fear, by dependency, by the desperate hope that someone else's presence will complete a void you have never truly faced alone. What if the deepest revelation is this? The psychological trap of marriage is not marriage itself, but the illusion that your value and freedom depend on its permanence. That the ground beneath your feet, the beating heart within your chest, is somehow less reliable than the walls of a shared home, a last name, or a ring. What if the real prison door is the one you carry inside, locked tight with the keys of conditional approval and self-denial? The secret no one admits is that you have held the keys all along, though you forgot, or were never shown, how to turn them. Imagine now what it means to dismantle this illusion, not violently, not in rebellion, but with the quiet courage of truth. To see your marriage not as a fortress or a trap, but as a mirror reflecting every unspoken fear and every unrealized longing. To meet this reflection without flinching, even when it shatters your previous sense of self, is the act of radical freedom. It is the moment when the prison walls dissolve, not because they crumble, but because you cease to believe in their power. This is not a call to abandon your vows or undo your life. It is an invitation to redefine them on your own terms, to map out a new territory within yourself where love is no longer a transaction, no longer a currency for survival, but a fierce celebration of your sovereignty and mutual respect. To envision a partnership where two whole beings move together without losing their distinctiveness, where freedom is the birthplace of love, not its casualty. Look closely at the faces in your memories, the laughter and the tears, the silences and the storms. They are not evidence of failure, but of the profound complexity of human connection. The psychological trap was never about marriage's promise failing, but about the promise you made to yourself remaining unexamined, unchallenged, and unbroken for fear of chaos. Now, chaos may be the catalyst. The crack in your story is the space where light seeps in. What if the final truth is this? Your relationship is not your reality. Your relationship is a lens through which your reality is perceived, distorted, and sometimes illuminated. The revolution you seek is not in altering the other, but in refining your vision. When you shift the lens, the patterns you once thought immutable, the feelings of entrapment, the cycles of resentment, the silent compromises, are no longer chains but symbols. Symbols of a journey inward, where the ultimate marriage to be honored is the one with yourself. And so, you stand at the edge of that revelation, where past struggles transform into sacred rites of passage rather than burdensome scars. You realize that the psychological trap was never a place but a perspective, a shadow cast by unexamined beliefs and the fear of solitude. But within you now burns a quiet flame, the recognition that to be truly married is to be utterly free, to be utterly whole alone, so that you might choose union not from need, but from overflow. Picture that freedom as a vast ocean, untamed, deep, and endless. Your marriage is a boat upon its surface, not its boundaries. You may sail close to shore or venture into unknown waters, but the ocean beneath is your own soul's expanse, always ready to receive you, to nourish you, to reclaim you. The question remains, whispered like a secret beneath your breath. Will you continue to live within the confines of a story told to you, or will you craft your own, one where freedom and love are not enemies but twin flames? Will you dare to confront the truth that your marriage was never the trap, but your unawareness was? And in that confrontation, will you find the courage to rewrite everything? This is your invitation, not to escape, but to awaken, not to find someone who completes you, but to become complete, not to endure, but to transcend, because the deepest, most unsettling truth is also the most liberating. The prison of marriage exists only where you forget your own sovereignty, and the revolution waiting within you is the rebirth of that forgotten power. So breathe deeply into this revelation. Let it shake your foundations and rebuild them with the bricks of fierce self-love and unrelenting truth. The psychological trap no one admits is not a sentence to be served, but a myth to be unraveled. And on the other side of that unraveling, something extraordinary awaits: your freedom, your peace, your true marriage to the unshakable self you were always meant to be.